that are known in localized communities, because that's oftentimes the way in which they're known, i.e. Latin American folk saints are not known halfway across the world for the very reason that these are often local canons and local cultural stories that get carried on through like cultural and social vernacular. I'm going to talk about 5 things in this debate. First of all, what is the comparative on our side? Quite simply, we think the Catholic Church should officially recognize them. That means integrating them into local canons and telling the global Catholic community that these individual folk saints are going to be canonized in similar ways as existing saints that do exist. So that means we're okay with them. We don't think these individuals have sinned. Second of all, what is the interest of the Catholic Church? I think broadly it is 3 things. The first is to consolidate power. So things, for example, like being able to ensure that individuals seek legitimacy through the Catholic Church. Second of all, things, for example, like the continuation of that religion. So things like getting donations and getting followership, so meaningfully able to continuously sustain that religion even far into the future. But finally, it looks like ensuring that there's some degree of legitimacy in uniquely the top level doctrine of the Catholic state. So what this means is the Pope. The reason as to why this is the most important is because the Pope is the most important figure within the Catholic Church, but also just like realistically speaking, that's the individual that matters most. Great. We have one simple argument with a lot of impacts. Argument, while you consolidate and allow for the goals of the Catholic Church to be better established. The premise of this argument is fairly simple. The vast populations that we're talking about in this debate that identify with folk saints are individuals that uniquely identify with them, who will feel alienated as a result of the policy on opposition. Why is it that these vast populations uniquely identify with folk saints? I think there are 2 things to recognize. The first is because of the significance of local social cultural vernacular. That is to say, these individuals grow up in a community in which these folk saints are widely regarded as important and legitimate. No, thank you. Therefore, they oftentimes believe in it for the very reason that it's like local cultures as passed down by their grandmothers. But second of all, often they live similar lives as these individuals who are folk saints. So for example, if I'm in a low socioeconomic condition, that probably means I have to do things like steal, for instance. What that means is that I probably uniquely also have relatability with the folk saints who, for example, still to give to the poor, or who for example, have to cater towards like offering, for example, brothels and things of that nature. So to that end, I think what ends up happening is that the relatability of the folk saints with the unique lived experiences of these individuals on the ground likely means that in localized communities, these are the individuals that the community often identifies with. Why does this matter? There are 2 points of context I want to outline, which helps me illustrate the importance of said argument. The first thing I want to recognize is insofar as it is true that folk saints are the individuals that are widely regarded within this community, I think what ends up happening when the Catholic Church says that these folk saints are sinners is that you enrage and piss off a lot of individuals on the ground. But second and more importantly, it's important to flag out the context of the rise of secularism and the decreased wane in religiosity. That's to say, people no longer adhere to traditional religious values, and increasingly the Catholic Church, for example, are getting less retention in like followership. The reason as to why this is the case is very simple. First of all, you have things like the rise of secularism and governments oftentimes not being theocratic regimes. Second of all, individuals often perceive religion to be relatively arduous for the very reason that it is hierarchical. But third and most importantly, there's a perception of a time deficit that takes, right? So if you have to spend like half of your Sunday in like doing religious things, it is oftentimes preventing you from doing things like self-actualizing. As a result of that, the rise of things like entertainment and social media means that individuals no longer engage with religion. Why is this then important in this debate? I'm going to flag out 4 impacts. The first impact is that absent this official recognition, you uniquely alienate individuals on 2 grounds. First of all, you literally piss on the thing that they hold most dear to their heart, and you say these individuals are sinners, we do not care about them. This is probably harmful because you piss off a lot of individuals. But second and more importantly, I think you also actively demonize the individual followers that believes in Catholicism, but also deeply follows the folk saints, right? Recall the characterization that these individuals who really like the folk saint probably live very similar lives as these individual folk saints. So things, for example, like they steal off them because of their socioeconomic condition. So when the Catholic Church says that X folk saint is a sinner, that indirectly by proxy means that I as a Catholic follower is also a sinner because I do very similar things as that individual folk state. What is the harm and the impact of this? First of all, you just demonize a lot of individuals within the Catholic Church, and as a result of that, these individuals end up leaving. These individuals also don't support you, and these individuals on principle probably feel pretty left out. Insofar as the Catholic Church cares about the continuation of the religion, but also caring towards the most vulnerable, these are individual actors that are important. The opposition side uniquely neglects. But second and more importantly, it also means you lose out on the influence of the church. So the first way in which this is done is you just like visibly have less members. That is cyclically a problem because perceptually, if people think the Catholic Church is weaker because less people attend mass, for example, example, then you get less individuals in the future also willing to join. But secondly, you also just get less donations, for example, because numerically, if you have less individuals participating in a church, because you alienate a fraction of that individual by demonizing and denouncing folk saints, then these are individuals that are also therefore not going to give you money. That means you can't do things, for example, like build new infrastructure projects that legitimize your position in local communities and do things, for example, like get money that's important for the Catholic Church. The second impact is you also lose out on the ability to do outreach in the future as well. The reason as to why this is the case is because uniquely, given that folk saints are popular in local communities, I think local communities form niches. That means that they often outreach towards other individuals in that community and pull them into the religion. So to the point in which you alienate these individuals, or rather comparatively on our side, you uniquely galvanize these individuals are able to reach out to far more individuals in the long run. The weighing of this argument is, even if to some extent it dilutes the church, which I don't think it does, this is important because the a priori good of the Catholic Church is to ensure its survivability. It happens when you have members, which happens on our side of the house. Before I go on, closing up.
Yeah, so why is like the recognition of these folk saints like an effective means of connecting with alienated individuals if you still continue to denounce things like homosexuality?
Right, so that's my next argument. The first thing I want to flag out is like, I think it is far better because you acknowledge, for example, similarities between folk saints and the individuals on the ground. But second, and this is the last part of my argumentation, this is also good because of the current trajectory of the Catholic Church. Context right now, the Pope is liberalizing, right? The Pope is doing things like allowing for gay marriage within the Catholic Church, recognizing important social issues like climate change and other social justice issues. There are two reasons why. The first is because the Catholic Church wants to appear as mainstream, for instance, given the liberalizing trend. But second of all, it's a strategic pivot that the Catholic Church takes in order to include more individuals, for example, like side B Christians. What then are the harms? Are they comparative? First of all, you significantly delegitimize the Pope, which is the most important thing given the weighing. The reason why you do this is because if localized communities say, we're not okay with an individual who might be homosexual or who might steal, that is directly in contrast with what the Pope is saying, which is we are okay with things like homosexuality because God has given us rights, for example, and choices. So to that end, you delegitimize the Pope to the point which you're contradictory with the Pope. But second, and more importantly, I think also therefore means that you get massive discussions on local levels about whether or not the Pope is legitimate, which is probably bad because you question the legitimacy of the Pope, but also because you probably get things like confusion. And given that time and donation is zero sum, you get people who are disillusioned with the movement as a result of that. For all those reasons, Catholic Church better on our side. Happy to propose.
Right. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, am I audible? And is it okay to turn off my camera due to the connectivity issue?
Sure, no problem. Do you want me to turn off my camera too?
No. It's okay for me to turn off my camera.
Sure. PR preference.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is really unfortunate panel. The debate, the motion says, I would like to draw your attention again. This House believes that it is in the interest of the Catholic Church to officially recognize folk saints, it is in the interest of the Latin American, somewhere in locality Catholic Church to officially recognize folk saints, which is to say, when you are debating on an officially recognition of a folk saints, it's definitely come from the church community. That is to say, the post and the globally to a large extent, which exactly mean it definitely going to be a huge announcement. Second, it definitely make the church liable to take their particular decision and give justification why. 3, it definitely at least cross the globe and on the other localities, as it is a concept of folk saints, other types of folk saints, they have to legalize in the very first place. This is fundamentally really soft case played by opening government that we directly challenge the fiat of the debate in the very first place. I don't know how DPM would defend, but they have to make their burden. Hope CG would debate in a fair ground. Then why do you really think from side opening opposition in the very first place, why it is not definitely in the interest of the church in the very first place? You have to really understand how the religion works in the church perspective and what is the most important thing for the church in the very first place. Honorable panel, you have to understand that people support protecting that particular belief keeping the consistency of the belief. That means to like preaching the religions and making the homogeneity of the basic belief, the core belief in the very first place is the first interest. And you can do compromise by liberating. The liberation they're talking about, I don't know how the factually occurred in the very first place. Second, they didn't really show how the legitimize relevance in the very first place act versus officially recognizing a folk saint who is definitely not mentioned in the Bible, because in terms of like church interpretation, the saints and the religious figures are explicitly mentioned in the Bible, who and the folk saint is not different. Liberalization can be done. Yes, in past days, you would definitely kill LGBTQ people. Liberalization can come that, come on, yes, you're treated by God. If you can control your gaze, the God might forgive. This is type of liberalization is something really legitimized and okay for the church and the other religious institution to a large extent. This is something really important in the very first place. Why do you really think some extreme problems of uniformity comes by this decision, where they just simply want some inclusivity of this marginalized community in the very first place? First, they would extremely feel some backlash in the principle and also the support of the mass people, the mass followers to a large extent. Why so? Honorable panel, you have to understand the major Catholic believers who believe in itself this LGBTQ community and the sinful acts. If you do any sinful act, you would have to feel the punishment. You have to make yourself vulnerable in the day of the judgment. That is why they do seek church, and also the church sell this in the very first place. This belief, yes, you do sin, come to my church and ask forgiveness to God, and you will be forgiven. Understand, this is the core belief that is preached, spread, and fabricated from day-to-day activity like church activity, the religious activity, the religious festival, etc. The moment you officially announce this in the very first place, you acknowledge those acts in the very first place. Why it is extremely problematic? Number one, you are misinterpreting and creating and backlash of the Holy Bible and the religious scripts that you sell to follow. Second, it in itself creates a huge backlash of the general people who eventually believe their one unique way of forgiveness, one unique way of safe space, the church in the very first place. This is something the church is not interested, it's nothing, definitely not going to interest. Second, they're talking, as they talked, a localized church in the very first, which is not relevant in the debate. The funding, it comes to the side opposition side in the very first place. The fundings and the support is really important, and that comes from the majority of the people. Yes, as time progresses, that's what we told earlier, liberalization can be done. Liberalization can be done if you come to the church. Yes, if you can make yourself change, you can be forgiven by the God. This type of liberalization can be done. But violating the principle, the majority, 60, 70 to 80% follower who believe and go to the church for those particular reasons, that at the day of the judgment, if I do see that those things are sinful, and if they do sin, if I go to church, I will be make myself clean in the very first place. These people will definitely never feel engaged the church in itself. This will ultimately create a backlash in the religion, which is itself questioning the church activity. They're talking about the upliftment of the atheism. In the very first place, they will have a huge option to question the church. Look at this. This is something not unique. They can be changed. They can be interpreted. They can do whatever the situation demands in the very first place. They will easily question that what is the legitimacy of the religion in the very first place. Yes, CG, I would take. Yeah, closing government, please. If not opening.
Yeah, cool. There are currently 11,000 saints. 90% of them are never mentioned in the Bible. Most, if not all people, barely know 10. How is this something that is ever going to have sustained backlash, given how so few people actually know about this?
Okay, so does those saints are extremely recognized officially from the churches? No. Why so? Honorable panel, you have to really understand the basic principle of the religions and the localized thing to a large extent. You have to understand the gravity of official announcement in the very first place globally. You have to debate on that in the very first place, then come on the debate. If you're talking about very remote area, talking about very remote debate in the very first, this pretty different debate and nothing to do come with. You have to debate what we are trading from side of opposition. We're trading off some inclusivity, which can be done through different means and which can be done through different activity to a large extent. But just to understand what we are trying to maintain is the main homogeneity and consistency of the preaching of the church, and making my religions much more strong and more legitimate in the future, for the future, because they need to sustain for a long time. So hope proud to be the right side of the debate. Thank you.
All right. We thank Hello. TPM.
Cool, cool. Is everyone ready?
Audible, but POI preference.
You can just write it in the chat. I have the chat open. In the instance at which we get like 5:30, you can start like taking off your microphone and stuff like that. Cool. Okay. I'm going to be clear about this because OO spent a majority of their time complaining about what I just think is the actual way to debate this. I will handle the debate in the way OG conceives it and the way OO conceives it, and also prove that a majority of their arguments I think just simply are irrelevant. First, as a note, they just say multiple times that there are ways to get large amounts of inclusivity for these people, but I think it's the case that they missed the nuance that Ted gave you. Folk saints in aggregate to Christian canon and discourse are not that prominent, right? Because saints are themselves not the most prominent amount of discourse. However, it is in specific areas where the folk saints are relevant that the discourse is incredibly important. I'm totally fine with the Pope going out and say that they are going to be recognizing these folk saints, because for a majority of time, I would like to point out that the church already has a large canon of saints who don't have cultural relevance, who engaged in a lot of these things. So the challenge on OO is we have to explain why these people necessarily belong in the canon. First, in the way that you are qualified to become a saint. I want to be clear. These individuals are not just picked because they're popular, right? We're not making Nicolas Maduro a saint. We are picking individuals who are incredibly relevant in their communities. They likely engaged in community service. As pointed out in the info slide, the people that we are talking about are individuals who on the ground may have stolen and given to people who are poor, which by the way is simply just a reflection of Saint Dismas, who is the person who was crucified next to Jesus, who was known as the good thief. He actively went around and was mentioned in the Bible. So I think this empirical claim pushes out a good quantity of the OO arguments. But secondarily, it misses the actual argument that Ted gave you, that the individual people who live in these communities, and I think OO is rather glib about the potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of people that we could be talking about whose folk saints are relatively important to them, given that we could be talking about tens, if not hundreds of folk saints in individual areas who live lives that are very similar to them. OO tells us that we need to prove that these people were forgiven. But I want to be clear, if somebody is a saint, they have done things like given a miracle. They have to do two if they want to actually be recognized as a saint. But also they likely do a lot of community service. Why? First, because these people are likely very proximate to the church in order to be recognized as folk saints. The specific religious context and under connotation of individual folk saints implies that they were engaging in religious acts. Secondarily, it also tells us these individuals through the info slide were doing things through a specific lens. So it wasn't just helping people who are LGBTQ. It was also praying with them, being with them in times of need, and doing something that is helping the community in a very Christian way. So there's very obvious, measurable things that these people have done that would qualify them. So on the question of whether or not they have redeemed themselves, they have dedicated their lives to a form of community service, which has easily qualified people as being a saint into the future. Second, on the question of whether or not people can actually reform the church or the kind of doctrinal change that can come, I want to flag this right here. First, it's deeply unclear why this isn't congruent with the way that saints are picked now. As pointed out in the POI, there's tens of thousands of saints. People very simply do not categorize them, so they might be specifically important to people. Either they go to a church that was founded on the principles of a saint, given that there may, say, for example, religious universities that were founded in the name of saints. So the importance has very microcosm benefits, but the potential backlash is very nebulous. And remember the arguments that Ted gives you that get no response. A majority of the saints have done things that dominant Catholic doctrine has already relegated to be legitimate. There's a couple reasons why that'll reiterate here. First, the general rise of secularism. So the thesis of OO is that these people did things that were necessarily regarded as sinful, but is path dependent on believing that most religious people are zealots or they have strong religious beliefs. But Ted already preempts this argument by telling you that most people have largely secularized, and this is growing more apparent insofar as A, religion on the whole is declining, but also there is greater amount of multicultural religious denominations, which means that individual religions need to directly compete with each other. So the social and backwards draconian measures that people might hold right now are likely to be fleeting. Additionally, given that the Pope is already taking harder stances by saying that, for example, being gay is itself no longer sinful, means that we are course correcting for things that we have been wrong about in the past. So it means on the probability level, dominant church doctrine is already going to be changing in the favor of side government. What does that mean? First, if there is some amount of backlash, it is likely to be subsumed, if OO is right in their absolute best case, by the Pope coming out and defending these things. So if, for example, the Pope says they are willing to canonize and support things like gay marriage, this is clearly going to suck up all of the backlash about folk saints because clearly one is more manifest than the other. But if it is true that people hold this beliefs, then a majority of the OO arguments are non-unique. We likely think it is the case that most people don't actually hold these beliefs, nor do they actually care about these things because it doesn't necessarily interact with them. OO just asserts that these people care about it. But secondarily, I want to talk about the people who are also likely to backlash on their side of the house, because OO makes no explanation to justify why people who uniquely identify with folk saints and organize around the importance of folk saints aren't backlashing right now. I want to talk about why these people are important. First, based on the context of the inflow slide, it seems like they are in areas that comparatively rely more on the church for the fact that A, the government can't provide them services, the government is unwilling to provide them services, or they see the greatest benefit communitarily of having religion, which bites into all of the arguments that Ted gave you about why you want to increase the amount of membership, both current and expand to the potential people that you get. So even if it's true that we have backlash, OO misses the mechanization that Ted gives you in his speech as to why we get additional members. And it's important to note that these members are going to commit to becoming religious members, whereas I don't think people on opposite side of the house are likely to leave. Because if it is true that these people are religious zealots, where are they going to go? If you have formed your entire life on a very strong religious identity, and it really doesn't fundamentally change because it's unclear how folk saints are so fundamental, it's unclear why you're going to leave the church. But also, even if it is a fundamental change, people often still live in some degree of contradiction. So if it is true that the people that they are talking about are so tied to dominant religion and such an important part of their life, they aren't going to leave. The people we are impacting are those who are marginally attached and are at the threat of leaving that religion. So on the simple numerics alone, we're likely to leave. I haven't gotten a mention for a POI yet, but I'll take one from closing.
Yeah,
Seeing none,
so,
opening. Oh, closing, go for it.
cool. So like you give a lot of analysis about like how a lot of the things that these folk saints did are already legitimized by the church. So what is the real impact of still recognizing them if all of these things already exist in the world and are like currently recognized?
Yes, because the argument we are talking about is that it is a fundamental contradiction. If somebody did all of the things that qualifies them as a saint, they did all of the things right now, but the church doesn't recognize them as a saint, they are discriminately slighting them by not giving them the proper recognition. Because the thing is that being a saint gives you a specific title inside of the religious canon, that you did things that were beyond what a normal person is willing to do. The reason why people feel like those individuals deserve that is for all of the service they have given to the church. So it is about properly recognizing the things that have happened. But also, as Ted points out, there's also individual challenges that happens. And this is the other part of the PM that gets really just no engagement with. There are churches on the ground right now that do not agree that people should be recognized as folk saints and actively have to push off challenges. So if you are a church in a local area, ask you why they aren't recognized, why are you not giving them the legitimacy? That challenge is frequent because people live their lives feeling like they are now sinful because they live a similar life to that folk saint. And second, because there's a bunch of community association around it, it pushes them out further because of that contradiction. The result is that churches are constantly having to push off backlash. So it means that on their side of the house, there is a greater amount of backlash from people who care about this issue to a greater degree. And the total amount of people who are backlashing against the gov policy are marginal and are likely to be fleeting. And even if they did exist, are subsumed by other policies. This means the OO benefits are marginal and unlikely to materialize, and I think Gov gets way more people to be in religion in the long term. That's what you care about. Proud to propose.
All right, thank you, DPM. Dialog. Hi. QI preference, and also just to clarify, this is DAS, right?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Pure preference from church. It's all right. So just give me a couple of seconds to stop the time. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Catholic churches take decisions from the Pope strictly, that words make them differences from the Protestant and other form of religious activities. When you declare a folk saint as a Catholic saint and whatnot, that means the Pope is actually agreeing with the fact that these people need to be integrated, and even if this is not a sinful act that has been explained by my LO in the very first place. Understand why we really believe this form of integration is really harmful for the community, A, and B, this form of integration and this form of acknowledgement is literally going to give a backlash to the church nowadays when you're liberalizing the factor. Right, so there are a lot of thousands of folk saints probably present in this world, but they are not literally acknowledged by the church, because there are literally thousands of folk saints that have a lot of devotee and they can be locally traded and all. But when a central authority is actually determining the factor that yes, their devotee and their acknowledgement is already right and you should be there, due to the factors that they are not contradictory to our determining factors that has been written in Bible, that meaning you are literally contradicting the factors that yes, LGBTQ people are not doing immoral things. B, your stealing is not a immoral thing. Why would you really believe these folk saints are this? When you are actually acknowledging these folk saints, you are doing an immoral act. Understand what's the purpose of this folk saints in the Bible or in any form of Holy Grail. The thing is that these saints are the way that you communicate through your life through the God, right? So these folk saints take your prayers and try to communicate with you in the God in the afterlife. So when in the Bible that has been written that if you do sinful acts, A, you are not going to hear from the God, B, the God is not going to hear from you, and C, in the afterlife you are going to face a lot of dreadful acts in the future, right? So when you are actually acknowledging the fact that these people also have a life and your prayer is going to get hit from the God, that means A, you are undermining the people who are actually following your life very strictly, not doing any form of immoral act, not doing any form of sinful act, not stealing even if they are facing hunger, just believing in the God. B, you are actually taking away the love of the God, that even if you are actually dying, the church is there to save you, the God is there to save you, there is a community of your religion base who is going to save you, and you not need to steal, because if you're going to steal, there's a lot of repercussion you have to face. There's a lot of repression that you are going to face in the future life. That meaning you are taking away the chances of the people not living an immoral life and whatnot. So trying to integrate this form of people, you are giving an unjust act to the people who are actually truly devoted to your community. B, what sort of backlash this form of people is going to face? Understand, even if you recognize these people, they are doing not immoral act, and even if you understand this LGBTQ community people is still facing a lot of hatred. B, community is not going to actively participate in you in the community, and as a result, when the church is trying to acknowledge these people, they are Catholic and they need to be participate in the community. That meaning that these people are going to face much more backlash from the community, because these people actually contradicts their religious identity and their religious livelihood, right? So understand, when in this liberalizing space, the Pope is going to acknowledge this factor, the church is going to get a lot of undermining factor, A, and B, the credibility the church have upon the people and the community is going to be listened. Why this is very impactful? Because in this liberalizing world, we are facing that the religion, the institutional religion is losing their credibility, because they are facing that these people are not. These people are actually not getting done by this word. Understand, when this sort of scripture and indoctrination is placed there, because upon the birth, and there's a lot of questions placing, and you are changing your scripture, you're changing your moral codes according to the society. That meaning, A, this moral conduct you still are not believing, and this can be screwed up in the very first place, and B, your moral conduct can be changed, and this is the very harm and hit to the people who actually strongly believe this is the very first place. right? So coming back to the arguments from the opening government, that can that integrated people in the very first place? No, we believe that can't integrated people, because that people are facing things in the local atmosphere, and if you need to integrate the people, you need to go forward to them, try to integrate them in a local culture, rather than trying to acknowledge them from a central authority, rather than give them help, aid, trying to understand them what they are doing is a sinful act. And that's how a church, that's how a pope, that's how a saint should work, not rather than acknowledging them their sinful act is not a sinful act, right? So understand why now, if in this case, if you are actually acknowledging the factor, are you going to get enough form of donations? No, because those people, those conservative people are actually fleeing from your churches. B, they are not going to give you donations. Why? Because understand this, nowadays a lot of right-wing politics is actually rising, and when the church is actually declaring that these people are also under our umbrella, that gives a backlash, and you will probably get a lot less donations right now from the previous. So probably a lot of more conservative churches will be there, and a lot of things will be there. Any POI from CG, if not CG, then OG. Yes, OG.
Okay, cool. So in areas where you have folk saints and you have to tell people this person dedicated their entire life to service, they're still going to hell, why would anyone be a part of your religion if they're living a similar, if not identical life to the folk saint?
So understand, if you're living the life which is undermining, which is determined by the folk saints, then you need to determine that the people who are actually living in this local residence, they are the people who under the life probably in the local context, not doing things from a central authority, right? So when you're declaring things from a central authority, that gives a wrong message, that creates a bad precedence, and when this precedence is a set up thing, that probably will create a lot of moral backlash, right? So why in a comparative debate we actually win this debate? Because under our umbrella, when this indoctrinated religion is actually going by, we feel that a lot of people who are actually under this umbrella of this church probably will be much more fair, feel much more devotee, and feel much more better acceptable, right? And see that immoral act is not under their eyes, is not going to be accepted, and they will feel much more accepted in this church. And that's why by that church they live on their life, and with this livelihood they will feel the religion is entangled them. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
And yellow, member of CUP.
Am I audible?
Yep. PI preference.
POI preference. POI in the chat would be preferable. If I haven't taken a POI though by about 5:45, like I invite anyone to just interrupt. That's completely fine. Okay, cool. So starting in 3, 2, 1. Here's what happened in the front half, Judge. This is simply what happened. In the front half, the opening government makes a case about how the church needs to mobilize strength, that it needs to recruit more members, and that it needs to become like a new powerhouse in this instance. Fundamentally, this is a mischaracterization of the way the church currently stands and the position the church is currently in. Secondly, OO's case was a little bit community, and as a result, like none of this even matters. This was a weird characterization and a weird take to take in a round where we're currently facing a Catholic Church that is declining membership for the past 2 decades, that has many individuals choosing to leave the church, and that many individuals that traditionally follow this like doctrine, even if they stay religious, end up going to other forms of Christianity that are simply more accepting, more tolerant, and less stringent on a lot of these smaller issues. Here's what I'm going to do. Extension quickly, and then after that, quick refutation of everything that has been said so far on the opposition bench. Let's do this like 5-point extension, okay? Number 1, the characterization of OG on how the Catholic Church currently exists is wrong. The church is not on a current basis of trying to get more members and strengthen itself, right, from a position of strength. The church currently exists in a position of weakness. Why? The biggest issue is that a number of members of the church are frequently becoming a-religious, or they're defecting to different Protestant branches that they think they can identify with more. Like look at the evangelicals, look at Episcopalians, a lot of these different examples end up arising. This is a mass exodus that currently exists, right? Places like Quebec in Canada, for example, is where 50% of individuals in Catholic communities literally don't continue their religion forward. In Brazil and Latin America, where this debate actually takes place, the demonstrable effect is even more dramatic, with like 65% of Brazilians now identifying as Catholic, which is significantly less than what it was way, way before. But what does this mean then? Why are individuals choosing to go to church less, right? There is a number of reasons why. For the first one is very, very simple, right? For these individuals currently, right, in the status quo, the majority of the people leaving the church, we need to identify this because no one really does this, is like young people, right? The reason why it's young people choosing to leave the church and then choosing to not pass on the church beliefs is because of two inconsistencies that exist. One, a lot of young individuals have moral values that they believe are very important to their lives. And while they still want to believe in faith, while they still want to be a part of religion, they cannot reconcile their own individual moral values of believing that queer people should not be oppressed, of believing that petty crimes like this shouldn't be severely punished, with the strict doctrines that exist within the church, right? So there's a moral incongruency that happens that allows young people to end up leaving. But the second thing, right, is that the church has become fundamentally incongruent with their own principles. And this deals with a lot of the stuff that OO says, right? Notably, the Catholic Church was founded on the principle of the New Testament, which routinely says that not only is like every single person a sinner, but no one can lead a perfect life and all sins exist and individuals will always have them. The purpose of the church then was not then to say that everyone should lead a perfect sinless life, but instead to say that since we are all sinners, we can only find salvation from the salvation of Christ, right? That means, right, that a lot of the New Testament doctrine is fundamentally being ignored in the status quo because a lot of the Catholic Church canon in the recent years has been going after individuals for committing particular sins, right? And this is where it's super important that incongruency is like seen even much more, right? It's the fact that like in the same chapter where homosexuality is condemned in Leviticus, there are also a lot of other things that are condemned, like wearing clothes that are made out of more than one fabric, with the same severity of punishments of literally being stoned to death, right? But the Catholic Church selectively only punishes certain sins because of histories and decades of like traditions of homophobia. What does this mean? It means when you consistently see these types of moral inconsistencies in your own church, your faith in that church ends up being demonstrably reduced. But more than that, third point of extension, not really mentioned at all by front half, is the way in which this affects indigenous communities. Because here's the thing, this is a debate about Latin America. So what does Catholicism in Latin America look like? Catholicism in Latin America is not like Western European Catholicism. There is a mixing of indigenous myths as well as Catholic like lore that gets put together in the unique practicing of faith that exists within Catholicism. This looks like the official canonization of individuals and figures like the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is a uniquely Latin American tradition that is super, super important, right? This means a number of things, right? This means historically, a lot of the indigenous communities, especially in the Riviera Mayas region of Latin America in like Guatemala and Mexico, didn't historically practice things like homophobia, didn't historically practice a lot of these punishments for petty crimes that we're seeing of the modern like European traditions. And the Catholic Church fundamentally is incongruent with a lot of these values. This is why a lot of these folk saints are actually so popular in these regions, because they're much closer to the types of indigenous moralities that already exist. And as a result, these are very important for a lot of these indigenous communities in Latin America. This is why in the past, there's a precedent of the Catholic Church repeatedly making concessions to be able to include a lot of these indigenous myths and beliefs into the Catholic lore in order to make it more acceptable for indigenous people to practice the faith. This looks literally like Dia de los Muertos, which is like a mix of Aztec culture and Catholic traditions in the status quo in Mexico, right? This is something super, super important that the Catholic Church has historically done. Now on to refutation. Before I get into refutation, I just also want to say, like, we think fundamentally OG, like, characterizes the church as much more tolerant than it actually is. Pope Francis actually didn't say that he supports same-sex marriage. In fact, he's not even sure if he supports civil unions for same-sex like couples. So like that's something that we fundamentally just think we're going to like debate that we're just much more accurate on in this debate. But let's go into refutation of everything that has been said so far, right? Notably, number one, right? They say on their side of the house, the consistency of the church needs to be maintained. The church is nothing but inconsistent, right? Literally, St. Peter was married, but now priests literally cannot have wives, right? It wasn't even until the 10th century that priests were asked to have like unmarried or be celibate. It wasn't until the 12th century that the Catholic Church started to mention angels. And when a lot of the Eastern churches came back, they were allowed to still stay married despite a lot of the other priests having to be celibate. The Catholic Church is not one unified doctrine. There are many disagreements and different traditions and liturgies that exist within the Catholic Church. Many of them are competing. Many of them are not consistent with each other. Right. So the claim that the church needs to have this one unifying doctrine is utter bullshit. Right. But more than that, they say like, oh, some saints were never like mentioned in the Bible? Yeah, most of them weren't, right? St. Thomas Aquinas wasn't, St. Augustine wasn't, Pope John Paul wasn't because he was canonized in 2014, right? The majority of saints were never mentioned in the Bible, also irrelevant. The big thing then from OO that actually remains is like this thing about how like they think that people are going to leave the church for a lot of these instances. Here's the number one thing. The people that might potentially like not be okay with this type of an action are the most like passionate people of religion, right? But more than that, right? OO assumes, right, that the way that these traditions work is that like these saints are simply like, just like helping these individuals because of all these other matters, right? But the Bible doesn't say you can't help people that come from queer communities, right? The Bible doesn't say any of that, right? So this is not really arguing on the basis of theology. If you support OO, your church is basically accepting all these radical beliefs that have been declining your membership and making people turn away from you. I am so proud to propose in this debate.
Thank member of CAF, invite member of OP. Also, speakers are reminded to ask POIs.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, audible. POI preference.
Yep, I'll take POIs in the chat. Just give me a second. I'm setting up my timer. Yeah, opposition. Okay. Okay, I'm starting in 3, 2, 1, start. From closing opposition, we'll be broadly covering a few things. We'll cover the idea of the sort of people who are affected by this motion. We'll be talking, somehow we didn't have a discussion on that, I don't know why. But secondly, we'll talk about how church functions as a hierarchy and why that's a very unique extension on our side and why that's quintessential in this debate. Lastly, we'll talk about the counterfactual and what world we'd rather live in. But before we go into all of that, I just quickly want to frame out CG from the debate. I think CG's debate, very, very principled. Please, panel, look at your notes. They're filled with principles, and I agree with all of them. I actually think that the chart should have been fair. And by the way, I'm also engaging to OG here because OG also says those people really, the folk saints really lived ideal lives and we should really, really honor them. I absolutely agree. It's not about principles in this debate because it's about what the church needs to do for its best interest at this point in time in history. The reason this is an extremely clear distinction is because you need to acknowledge that just running arguments like, oh, the church once said don't wear this fabric, but now people are okay with wearing that fabric, is because that fabric isn't a crucial part of the current member's lifestyle, as is the institution of marriage. Institution of marriage matters to the current rallying base or the current core base of Christianity or Catholic Church, to the point where we think that that is significantly more important than, like, I don't know what sort of fabric they used to wear in the 1700s and why that was banned. We think that clear distinction was absolutely missing in CG's case. But most importantly, look at your notes. Every argument that closing government gives is an argument without any mechanization, which means in no world do they ever show you why any of that can lead to more followers in the future. They never show you the mechanism through which church can benefit through passing this motion in the future, other than saying, hey, it's the right thing to do. By the way, I absolutely agree, absolutely right thing to do, but it's not in the best interest of the church to do this at this point. Why? Takes me to my extensions. Let's look at the groups of people who will be affected by this. First, let's talk about the current followers of folk saints, right? And somehow opening opposition really did a horrible job at this because they never talked about them, but I really want to have a conversation about them, right? Current followers of folk saints. These are people who grew up in the favelas of the Latin American countries where these folk saints are extremely popular. Those followers have been ostracized for their lifestyles by the church for centuries and centuries. Those ostracization, those oppression won't be forgotten overnight just because they will be like, hey, you know what? These are churches. The more likely reaction you will get from these people aren't stupid. Please don't treat them like stupid. I beg the government whip to not treat them like stupid. These people are likely to look at this as an opportunistic policy to whitewash history and to remove the years of oppression that the church has directly inflicted upon these people. That's exactly when you're likely to face even more challenge within these communities, where in favelas people will come out and say, hey, this person isn't your saint because you ostracize their lives, you ostracize everyone who followed that lifestyle, and now you can't claim ownership of that saint just because Pope Francis said so. We think that determination, that challenge is likely going to worsen the position of Christianity. And in my counterfactual, I'll argue why that's the worst possible strategy to take at this point in time. But let's look at the current followers of Roman Catholicism, right? We credit O for introducing this, but we will really, really mechanize this, right? What happens to the most loyal supporters of the church? O talks about funding, but let's go into the details of why they're affected in the first place. We think these people grew up cherishing, the most loyal supporters of Christianity are the ones who grew up cherishing the institution of marriage, things like sins, what definition they mean, all of these things very, very closely, right? The point in time, you now acknowledge, by the way, sins are really, really important in Christianity. I don't know why both government teams try and downplay that. That's honestly like just minimizes the impact of their debate, because like saints are important, and if you make a saint, everyone in the planet will start talking about it. That is literally just empirically true. I don't know why the Western media won't cover this because OG said so, right? Everyone will definitely be talking about this. Now, this avid followers of religion who have been religious their entire lives will now feel attacked. This will become a war of them versus us, where they will feel like not only are we accepting gays into our religion, which by the way Christianity still isn't. So it's not just accepting them, it's literally directly making them saints of our religion. This means they're directly trying to take over our religion. That directly puts people like Pope Francis on the spotlight and directly questions the legitimacy of these people staying in power. And OG clearly outlines this is a problem. We show you why that's going to be significantly worse in your world. But let's look at the churches in like hierarchy, right? This is an extension as well. I want to preface this argument by saying the church follows a very distinct structure. Pope is at the top, cardinals under him, bishops under the cardinals, and the fathers or local like priests just underneath them. Why is all of this important? The reason OG claims that LGBTQ are now normalized because Pope Francis said so, which is a lie. Thank you, closing government, for pointing that out. The reason that never went through is because local priests protested that. Because the only interaction that actual Christians, your everyday average Catholic Christians, or the most loyal followers of Catholic Christians have with the church is through their local parish, through their local churches, through the priests of their local churches. Those priests themselves didn't buy into the idea of accepting homosexuality as a core value or as active members of the religion, and hence they did not defend the stance Pope Francis initially had, which is exactly why Pope Francis had to stand away from that stance, back down, and move to other conversations because it was simply not winnable at that point in time. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah. So aside from the fact that the info slide says that folk saints are recognized as Catholic saints, which means that people want this recognition, why aren't local churches who rely on Pope funding, as OO said, not going to bend the knee because they need to stay open?
Absolutely not. That literally, I am giving you structural reason as to why this has already been a failure in an attempt to legitimize LGBTQ as part of this movement. Absolutely useless POI. But let's look at the counterfactual. I want to preface this by saying we don't have to have a counterfactual from opposition, but we're going to be super charitable to make the margin of win even greater. Let's look at the counterfactual. What would we rather have? We'd rather have gradual inclusion of people into religion. We have already seen examples of that, where divorcees have been accepted by church to go to Sunday prayers. They haven't been accepted as saints of the church. They haven't been accepted as Pope of the Catholic Church. They have been accepted to go into Sunday prayers, and that gradual inclusion is much better. If that gradual inclusion is a mechanism they can somehow have in the long term, we're absolutely okay with that. But this simply makes it worse, especially because people on both sides, current Catholic Christians and followers of folk saints, are both going to resist this, and we think that's not smart as well. We're also okay with things like missionary approaches, like building schools or healthcare, like improving the lives of people in favelas as a way to make reparations for the hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression that the Catholic Church has inflicted on those communities. And we think that's a much better way to earn goodwill into those communities, other than going in and claiming ownership over their saints, which honestly speaking, the church fucking shouldn't do. Very proud to be on the right side of this debate.
Thank member for the speech. Go for it.
Okay, sounds good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I think I heard a guitar or something. Can you try that one more time?
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
but
sounds good. Let me open up my timer.
PI preference.
Oh yes, you can just type in the chat. I have to like teach right after I finish my speech, so I'll probably have to like leave early, but it was a great round, everyone. Okay, sounds good. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate has been extremely unclear, and the only conception that you should trust, and the only conception of this debate that actually satisfies the burden of proving why this mechanism is necessary to protect the longevity and the existence of the Catholic Church into perpetuity is my partner, Vidit. Let's explain why. First of all, from opening government's biggest flaw is that they don't explain who exactly would identify with folk saints and the impact that this has on the Catholic Church's interests, right? All they say from opening government is that these people are just those who live in localized communities that are more so connected with the stories of these saints. Why is this a flawed conception, panel? It's flawed because it assumes the ability to relate to these saints is based on your proximity and familiarity rather than the values themselves, because it is likely the case that even with those who grew up in these communities that were deeply familiar with these saints, many of the older generations, for example, still wouldn't recognize them because they represent outdated and aged values the Catholic Church pushed. This also means that under OG's conception, it would be difficult even for people who recognize and align with these values to recognize them as saints insofar as they did not grow up knowing about them or near them, etc. Therefore, opening government doesn't prove to you two things. One, who is likely actually to be affected by this, and two, how we can use this to broaden the efficacy of Catholicism to people who have not previously been aware of the existence of these saints. How does then Vidit satisfy this burden? Vidit is the only debater in this round to tell you what demographic of people is most disillusioned with the Catholic Church. Firstly, it is the Latin American young people who are largely identifying as agnostic or spiritual or a-religious or other forms of Christianity or Protestantism. The reason being is because younger generations are more likely, due to multiple external factors such as like globalization, media, yada, 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 to hold increasingly progressive values, or at the very least, they're starting to feel the practices of modern Catholicism are very much outdated and incongruent to how they live their lives and their personal values. This means that one, it is likely that the recognition of these saints and the values that they represent will transcend the proximity and familiarity limitations that opening government sets for themselves. But this also ties into the second aspect of opening government, which is that their case is limited by their lack of mechanization for why the specific recognition of these saints would actually lead to a meaningful degree of reintegration of disillusioned individuals with the church. Because let's say that all these young people are just actually just like edgy Reddit r/atheism bros, right? Or like the real analysis being, let's say that these people just no longer find value with Catholicism in the first place anymore. The recognition, therefore, of these saints will probably prove very marginal impacts on buy-in and reintegration of the Catholic Church. So therefore, OG is very unclear in their explanation to why people who are LGBTQ, for example, would have their minds changed by this mechanism and fully reintegrate themselves with the practices and values of the Catholic Church, which is what government's burden was to prove to you. So then how does Vidit satisfy this burden, panel? He says that it is not that these young people are engaging in mass exodus of the church because they just don't care about Catholicism anymore. He is the only speaker in this round to characterize that the specific demographic of people that have caused an over 30% reduction in Catholic Church membership in Latin America are leaving the faith begrudgingly, because it is a reality, speaker, that the majority of people leaving are young people who come from Catholic families, growing up with Catholic traditions and practices, who find a deep degree of meaning in the faith, in the community that Catholicism creates, and in the ways that the scripture helps them make sense of the calamity and the horror that is their life, who has nevertheless chosen to discontinue their adherence to the religion because of the spiritual tension that exists between their own values and the rigid ones of the Catholic faith that, for all intents and purposes, especially for LGBTQ youth, labels their very existence as a sin and worthy of moral condemnation to hell. Before I go on, yes, Seal.
Again, young people aren't stupid. Just because you're trying to steal the legacy of these folk saints doesn't mean young people will buy that, especially because you are likely going to get a lot of protest from these communities in the favelas.
I'll get into the backlash point later, but as for young people for now, look, there's going to be a symbolic importance and impact that the recognition of these values have, right? Because you're literally canonizing these specific people and the values that they represent within your religion in the first place. It's likely this will provide some kind of solvency. So anyways, note that this also engages with the opposition bench when they suggest that there are alternative ways that mitigate backlash to reinterpret religious texts and achieves the same goal, right? Because they say you don't have to do this. Note that the reintegration of these people and these relationships with the faith cannot be repaired simply by reinterpreting the text and finding other ways to understand it. This can only be solved by officially recognizing as the Catholic Church the arbiter of what is canon in the religion to recognize these values. This is the mechanization that only Vidit gives you in the round to explain why this is necessary and why all of opposition's mitigatory material and mechanization for other ways to reinterpret text is insufficient. Note that this is also where OG is sufficiently engaged with opposition because they hand waved away opposite conception of the world that backlash would happen amongst devout practitioners of Catholicism right now, evident in O's lines of analysis, as well as like Sio's entire case that like is premised on the idea that this will create like a us versus them narrative. One, it is unlikely to be significant because Latin Americans have literally been campaigning to make them saints even till now. Why would they turn away if they succeed? But secondly, more importantly, Vidit is the only speaker that actually engages with opposition's best case scenario. We have a massive degree of backlash from the vast majority of practitioners of the religion. Let's take them at their best. Because one, he characterizes arises, who is likely to be affected, and two, how we can use this to broaden the efficacy of Catholicism. This is important because the longevity of the Catholic Church, and this is the impact speaker that Vidit characterizes for you, the longevity and the existence of the Catholic Church requires these young people to not just Latin American young people to not just join back to the church. It is also contingent on them teaching their children these values and passing it on into perpetuity. And this is a trend that Vidit establishes is likely to continue. And note, this is also where he gives the most nuanced analysis that differentiates Latin American Catholicism from anywhere else in the world about indigenous influences on Catholic practices that makes them accepting of sins like being LGBT that will resonate with a lot of people in Latin America that were influenced by these specific values that you officially have a high degree of impact in recognizing them as officially as the Catholic Church. But therefore, even in opposition's best world, where you accept that somehow the entire remainder of the Catholic base just turns on you for some reason, not recognizing these saints as a symbol of reformation of your values, dooms your church to failure on their side of the house. In the long term, we have more impacts for the ability to continue our faith. So after literally 3 or 4 points of mech, I find it laughable that CEO says Vidit has no mech, because their mech is literally you are giving respect to Latin Americans in their indigenous traditions, and to young Catholics, all of whom make up the vast majority of Catholics in Latin America. And the practical impact of this are very clear, right? Less people go to church speaker, less people spread and continue the tenets of your religion. You have less donations, you have less services, you have smaller constituencies that support politicians that push for and lobby for your interests within government that is contingent for the existence of the Catholic Church and longevity of the Catholic Church in the first place, right? The protections that exist right now for the Catholic Church in the form of tax exemptions and there's protections and state investment into religious infrastructure are all contingent on you being able to access this kind of broad support and broad support base amongst the Catholic voter base, right? So therefore, what this means is one, less politicians are Catholic, so less likely to lobby in your interests, which is an important pillar of your existence. But second of all, the constituents of these politicians are less likely to also be Catholic, meaning that the interest groups that are relevant to you and that will protect the existence of your church and ensure that you're able to pass on your religion, your practices, and your faith into the long term also don't exist anymore. You'll be able to hold less services, get less donations, and have less infrastructure to practice your religion at all. So these are the impacts that exist from not being able to resonate with and connect with the youth that necessarily must necessitate the mechanism of being able to recognize officially, symbolically these values through recognizing the existence of these saints canonically through the church. We're so proud to stand in proposition.
All right, thank God for it. Offer.
Just give me a second. So I would prefer POIs in the chat. I'll try to take one at about 5 minutes and 45 seconds, preferably from the opening half, but also I'm happy to take back half. Just give me a second.
The audio sounds a bit staticky for me. I'm just going to turn off my camera to see if it gets better. All right.
Okay. And if that doesn't work, I can potentially plug in my headphones or earbuds just because it might be a little bit more clear.
No, this is working fine.
Okay, then I will begin my speech. I think the biggest hole in mechanization that we see from both opening government and closing government is the assumption that people in indigenous communities or people in Latin America who buy into Catholicism buy into the institution of the Catholic Church over buying into the idea of God himself or themselves. I think that is a really big issue in this round because most of these people, if we go by their framing that they practice unique mixes of faith, do not buy into the institution of Catholicism, the mainstream Catholicism practiced in Rome or wherever it's actually practiced. I think that's a huge issue because they never engage then in explaining why the mechanism of the recognition from this institution is essentially what leads to the inclusion of people who have been institutionally oppressed by the same Catholic Church for years and centuries in the past. So I'm going to do one main thing for you in this speech, basically just summarizing and doing more clash through the main theme of the survival of the Catholic Church. Because at the end of the day, I think that is the only focus we care about in this debate, primarily the ability to keep the Catholic Church going into the future. Let's start with opening government in this debate. I think I already gave them a POI that actually was quite effective in dealing with a lot of their material because again and again, they continue to minimize their own material when they prove these very marginal impacts. What were these very marginal impacts they pushed towards? Firstly, the idea that saints are like these saints do things that are already recognized as okay, to which I asked, like, if these actions are already recognized as okay, like why then do we still need to recognize them? Because then the impact is very marginal. But like in general, I think most of their analysis surrounds around the idea that the recognition from this institution is essentially what's going to lead to the inclusion of people who have been pushed out by the church. That is clearly not enough mechanization, because A, they never tell you structurally why people actually need the recognition of the Catholic Church in order to like continue to buy into religion. But also secondly, I think they operate under the assumption that some recognition from the Catholic Church is enough to bring people who don't currently subscribe to religious norms or beliefs into religion. Notice that this debate is not about atheists. It's also probably not about religious zealots, because these are two groups that are either never going to buy into religion regardless, or people who are always going to stay in religious like institutions regardless of what happens. What this debate is really about then, once again, something that I think comes out of closing opposition exclusively, is either people who have been cut off due to the rejection of their certain actions, but they still kind of believe in the church, or not the church, but like God in general, or another group, which is people who are quite religious, but they have now some doubts towards the institution of the church. Note, both of these groups center around the struggle of questioning the institution of the church. Why is this uniquely harmful in this debate? Because given that we're talking about the survival of the Catholic Church, we care about the survival of this same institution. And if this institution is being continuously doubted due to the actions that they're doing in order to either gain or lose support, that's a really big problem in this debate, which is why we think OG already falls out. But let's see what CG gives us. Firstly, thanks for the history lesson, thanks for the religion lesson. Loved all the context because I did not know any of that. However, now that I have all of this context, I'm just really confused how that actually helps the closing government case. Because I think the first thing, or one of the main ideas they bring you, is this unique, exciting idea about indigenous communities, how they are like engaging in a mixed, unique practicing of faith that combines like traditions from indigenous Latin America with like Catholic religions. Really confused here, because firstly, why do these unique subsects of Catholicism then crave or need the recognition of the mainstream Catholic Church, considering they were oppressed by them, probably colonized by them in some countries, and like were forced to convert? But secondly, it just doesn't make sense to me why they perceive the buying into religion of these like individuals in Latin America to be into the institution of Catholicism, right? I think there's a fundamental difference between buying into like Catholicism as an institution with the Pope at the top versus believing in the Catholic faith, because that is something that has been passed along the generations because of things like colonization or like European proselytization. So the version of religion that people in Latin South America tend to believe in is a mix of culture and lifestyle, right? It's a mix of like all the things that closing government brings you, but all of this just proves why they don't need the validation of mainstream Catholic churches to officially recognize their folk saints. I think clash this then against the material we bring you on closing opposition, where we say this is actually going to lead to more polarization because people of these indigenous communities, people who practice this unique mixed faith, now feel as if their saints are being co-opted, because instead of recognizing the harms that have been committed towards these groups throughout history, recognizing that oppression was carried out towards them, the church is like, no, the saint is now fully legitimate now. They're never doing anything to pave the steps between reconciliation. That I think is a massive failure and actually pushes out supporters far more. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so the unique brand that you talk about is actually hundreds of millions of Catholics in Latin America, where the majority of the population is mixed, indigenous, and European, who have been campaigning for these recognitions for decades and decades. Why would they be offended by simply giving them what they have been campaigning for?
Sorry, but you don't get to just claim that they were campaigning for this. I think that's just like, I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't care. Because if that is true, then this debate cannot exist, because clearly then it's just not a balanced debate, right? Turn off your camera, that's kind of distracting. But secondly, I think the other issue in this debate is that even if we don't care about these people who potentially are going to be included, what's going to happen in terms of backlash? And this, I think, is another unique contribution we bring to you on back half. When we talk to you firstly about the church hierarchy, we tell you about the structure between the Pope as well as the cardinals and how local people protested like progression. This leads to a deadlock, meaning we cannot achieve progression when we recognize the saints. We also brought to you the idea that yes, the international community is probably going to talk about it, because when the Pope was like giving like mixed signals about maybe recognizing homosexuality, this was literally all over the news. This is clearly something that's being talked about because they're recognizing saints that are highly controversial for like more devout followers. Essentially what happens then is the impact we bring to you. We brought you the isolation of the devout following. We brought you the isolation of people who do buy into Christianity and probably aren't going to leave. But what happens then is they become more internally isolated. Two main impacts that we brought to you then were, firstly, the Catholic Church loses centralized power because they become more internally divided, meaning it's more difficult for them to remain powerful at the top. But secondly, this increases polarization, drifting towards these people being stuck in echo chambers of hate because now they don't subscribe into the same mainstream Catholicism. The Pope can no longer push progression onto his followers because he doesn't have the same level of legitimacy. These are all massive harms. It would never be beneficial then for the Pope to recognize these folk saints on the spaces very proud to oppose.
All right, thank Robert. Virtually pass the floor, shake hands, and you guys can leave the room. And or if you could confirm that stream